All right, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations. This first video is really going to be looking at the way in which the American general life changes, and then we'll look at culture, we'll look at the continued Cold War policies, and so on. So one of the things that we tend to associate the 1950s with, again, is this sense of happiness. You could certainly liken this to the post-World War I boom of the 1920s. We already discussed in class when we went over that era that to a certain extent is a myth, right? We know that after World War I, the farmers were struggling immensely, for example. And of course, we all know with the benefit of hindsight that the Great Depression was around the corner. Now, with the 1950s, we're experiencing a similar phenomenon, but to a certain extent, again, we need to think about the ways in which some of this happiness was sort of masking actually a sense of anxiety underneath, right? So again, you sort of see these images here are portraying that sense of happiness, right? It is not, we would be remiss if we ignored the idea that all of this is sort of celebrating American white culture. So we'll talk about some racial tensions that exist in the 1950s as we move forward. But in any case, think about other sources of anxiety in the 1950s. The 1950s started, we were in the middle of the Korean War. So even though this isn't happening at home, there was still this general sense of anxiety about the spread of communism. And the Korean War didn't go particularly well. So there was a lot of anxiety too, and in the sense that Americans suddenly realized that they maybe could not win all wars. They came out of World War II feeling very good, but after Korea, there was a lot more of a sense of uncertainty. Also, again, I talked about racial tension. Remember that in the 1950s, we already have the civil rights movement underway. The Montgomery bus boycott takes place in the 1950s. So that racial tension is very much there. And so in some ways, again, we think maybe the serene backdrop of suburbia was actually meant to sort of distract Americans from their fear of nuclear destruction. And we'll talk about that more later. So first off, let's think about the transition to Eisenhower's administration. We are going to see a shift to the Republican Party. We've had many Democratic presidents from Roosevelt. Well, I mean, Roosevelt was in the middle of his fourth term, and then we had Truman, right? So, we had this fairly long period with the Democrats controlling the White House. So let's think about why people were suddenly drawn to Eisenhower. First, in general, he was a very moderate Republican, so, he tended to appeal to a fairly wide audience. Of course, he has a similar background as many commanders-in-chief in that he had a military background. In particular, he was there at D-Day in Normandy. So, of course, a very heroic event for American military history. And then also we need to think about his running mate, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was already popular at this point because he presided over the Alger Hiss trials, which we talked about previously. That was a McCarthy-era hearing where, you actually have a politician who goes to jail for his alleged association with the Communist Party. So Nixon kind of had that notoriety going into it. But what's interesting is then later a scandal came out about Nixon during the campaign. It was revealed that he was actually using some of his campaign funds for personal uses. And he also got a lot of gifts, including this dog here, Checkers. All right, so he's considering dropping out of the race. But then he ends up giving a speech on television directly to the public. And he actually uses his dog Checkers, who was this gift, to basically win over the support of the people again. He talked about how, he would, return certain political favors that were given to him. But, his family had this attachment to this dog Checkers. So he sort of appealed to the emotional senses of the American public, and it worked. This was called the Checker speech. So, be familiar with that in terms of how something as simple as a man's love for his dog can get the public to rally behind him. Also, the Eisenhower campaign was successful because one of his platform promises was that he was going to end the Korean War. And we know eventually the Korean War armistice is going to be signed when Eisenhower is president. Another thing about Eisenhower is that he actually was pretty moderate in terms of many of his approaches. In particular, his domestic policy continued a lot of the sort of New Deal like policies. So on the one hand, he was seen as more of a businessman than somebody like Roosevelt, but so, you know, in the sense that he filled his cabinet with corporate executives. But he actually maintains quite a bit of the welfare state that we got used to during the New Deal. Many conservatives actually told him to dismantle the welfare state. So it's important for us to realize that he's actually going away from the more right-wing people in his party. So he basically, you know, accepted that there were many New Deal programs that at this point were a reality of modern life. And some of these New Deal programs he actually extended. So he extended Social Security, for example, to 10 million more citizens. He also raised minimum wage because he knew, you know, that inflation certainly adjusts one's cost of living, and you do need, you really do need to periodically raise minimum wages to reflect that. He also got the federal government to provide more public housing. He appointed the first a woman into a Republican cabinet. We know that FDR actually appointed the first woman, period, his Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, but this is the first time we had a Republican president appoint a woman into cabinet. But of course, this is also the first Republican president we have since Roosevelt. So her name was Oveta Kolpavi. We see her down here. She was the Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He also prevents a soil bank program to continue to reduce farm production and to also increase farm income. So we could see that to a certain extent as a continuation of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is interesting because we know that that was actually found unconstitutional during the New Deal. He was not totally in favor of extending all welfare programs. We see that in that he did actually reject federal health care insurance and federal aid to education. But, you know, we see with the other examples above that he does favor some continued New Deal-like programs. So because of his reputation with domestic policy, he got a reputation as being a moderate Republican. So he's not a full laissez-faire approach type president if you would compare him to the presidents of the 1920s. There were two brief recessions during Eisenhower's presidency, but there was an increase considerably in real wages, so there was not a huge amount of public anxiety about that. So again, we do see that for, at the very least, the sort of white middle class or even blue collar family, there's a greater sense of prosperity in the 1950s. The federal government actually provided loans for homes and assisted the growth of suburbs. We discussed this a bit in the previous chapter, but one of the most known communities, first planned communities, was Levittown, New York. It had 17,000 homes in it. So we see that the government is actually sponsoring suburbanization, but there were no African American residents there at first, and this newspaper article down here indicates to us that when there was a black family that moved into Levittown, there was a scandal that resulted. So Levittown gives us a sense that suburbanization is becoming more popular. This again reflects the anxiety of the nuclear age because people figured if there would be a bomb, it would be dropped on a city. So you see a sort of a mass exodus from the cities as a reflection of that. Another thing that we need to think about is that the federal government is trying to provide new services to its veterans. This is most best manifested by the GI Bill, which gave subsidies for education for veterans, but it also helped subsidize mortgages. So we see that many World War II vets were given a greater opportunity to advance their education and presumably get a better career out of it. This is an important precedent that is actually continued in the current armed services. There are GI Bill benefits still. They're not as widespread. They can't necessarily pay for all of one's college expenses, but they are certainly an initiative to people who might not otherwise afford higher education. Eisenhower also passed the Interstate Highway Act in 1956. This is actually one of Eisenhower's most permanent legacies because all the interstate highways, basically any highway that has a blue sign, is an interstate highway, right? So for us, the most familiar one would be I-95, right? So the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 authorized the construction of 42,000 miles of interstate highway. This linked all of the nation's major cities. So this is, of course, another manifestation of the fact that the United States is very much a car-oriented country now, not a train-oriented country like it might have been in the 19th century. And it also provides a model for a lot of European highways and also world highways as time goes on. Even the German Autobahn was inspired by American freeways. It also justifies the U.S. government's policies to place new taxes on fuel, tires, and vehicles. So it provides an additional source of revenue. And one more thing, of course, we remember that when Sputnik was launched in 1957, there is a greater federal dedication to spending money on education. So Eisenhower actually becomes a little bit more liberal in terms of that social welfare program that he was previously resistant to. Another thing, I already talked about how suburbanization is increasing during the 1950s. Here we see the portrayal of sort of the typical suburban housewife living the domestic ideal, providing a model of efficiency, patience. This is the kind of wife that we see portrayed in television. But of course, the reality is that if you're below a certain socioeconomic bracket, women had to continue to work. So it became a sort of double burden in the sense that they would have to work outside of the home and then come home and fulfill their motherly duties because it was sort of unheard of for a man to sort of fulfill those duties, right? We are going to see an increase in church attendance after the Second World War. One of the reasons why that is because communism was seen as sort of an a-religious or totally secular ideal. So some people kind of felt like fighting communism could also be manifested in their own religion. And religion also stressed the idea of conformity and fitting in. California, we see this is a highway that's being built in Los Angeles, was sort of an embodiment of post-war suburban life because cars were essentially mandatory in California, and also it shows us the sense of suburban sprawl. If you think about the Los Angeles area, the downtown is relatively small. It's the suburbs that just continue to expand for forever, right, to really make up this humongous metropolis. We do see a lot of economic growth in the 1950s. Part of that is attributed to a fairly low inflation rate. You have, this is the wartime inflation rate, but once we get to 1950, you see that it definitely drops off considerably. Deficits also fell in relation to national wealth. And so we see here in this graph here, take a look at the federal deficit and what happens to it in the 1950s. Additionally, between 1945 and 1960, the per capita disposable income of Americans more than tripled. So we see that represented here, right? This is a very significant indicator of economic growth. By the mid-1950s, the average American family had twice the real income of a comparable family during the boom years of the 1920s. So we definitely get a sense in how the post-war economy is doing in the 1950s. Another development is that union membership is actually growing in the 1950s, but we're going to see that it reaches a peak in the mid-1950s. So you see here trade union membership, obviously, it's increasing considerably during the Depression with all of FDR's sort of pro-union legislation, like the Wagner Act, for example. Good source of review. And then in the World War II era, we also see a dramatic increase in unions. By about 1955, it reaches its peak. This is, of course, when the AFL and CIO merged together. This is sort of the zenith of all labor unions working together. But then after 1955, you're going to see that there are going to be new encroachments on the public sector and union membership is going to start to decline. All right, so let's talk about some people that were sort of critical of the sense of suburbanization and post-war culture. Some people accuse this new life as being dull and conformist. So basically, there were some people that said that suburbanization might actually sort of obscure the sense that there still were very much class and ethnic differences found throughout the country. This critic down here, his name was David Reisman, he said that Americans were too conforming and they were less individualistic and they were more peer-oriented, which is an interesting source of criticism because in a way, the United States was sort of rebelling against communism, which they saw as something that caused you to abandon your individual identity. But here you have critics here who are actually saying that Americans are also doing just that by doing things like moving to the suburbs. You also have people like C. Wright Mills who said that people sold out their personalities as well as their time and energy. So, they're kind of criticizing the idea that these cities are certainly not the kind of social centers that many European cities were. All right. Another thing is that we do see a lot of development in education and health after the war. Of course, we know that the baby boom contributed to a dramatic increase in the birth rate. And this is accompanied by a tremendous expanse of higher education. And this is made possible by extensive federal aid, like the GI Bill. Colleges also started to accept corporate culture values. You're going to see a dramatic increase in the number of people who major in business in college, about 20% more. So basically you see that even college students are trying to conform to corporate values. The introduction of widespread immunization also took place after the war. You're also going to have new medicines like antibiotics, and also the polio vaccine is developed, which obviously is monumental because polio really represented an epidemic before the vaccine was available. So you're also just in terms of medical developments going to see a general improvement in the quality of life. But that does not mean that there's equal access to healthcare. Americans in rural areas were still more restricted to access, partly just due to the fact that there weren't as many medical facilities like hospitals in rural areas. The American Medical Association did not do very much to encourage the flow of new doctors to communities that didn't already have them. So they're criticized for that. And also the American Medical Association didn't encourage any kind of national health insurance. So, we do see that there's also an economic block to widespread equal health care. So that's the end of the first video. We'll pick up with more of the sort of rock and roll and film and television culture in the next one. Thanks.